120 miles per hour. Conditions are already deteriorating. The storm is targeting the Sarasota area just south of Tampa. It's a region that hasn't seen a hurricane this powerful in more than 100 years. The White House is warning it will be unlike anything residents have ever seen before. Now, at this hour, officials say it is too late to get out. If you did not evacuate, it's time to shelter in place. Let's listen now to the President of the United States.
Within a few hours, Hurricane Milton is expected to make landfall on the west coast of Florida, the western coast of Florida. Already we're seeing impacts from the storm, including significant winds and heavy rain. And there's also been frequent and widespread tornado warnings throughout the day, and they're continuing and expected to expand as Milton moves overland, including a few that have already touched down in South Florida. Currently, Milton is a Category 3 with wind speeds up to 120 miles per hour. But no one should be confused. It's still expected to be one of the most and worst destructive hurricanes to hit Florida in over a century. You know, both the heads of the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service made it very clear in conversations I've had with them earlier today. Milton still carries incredible destructiveness, can wipe out communities, can cause loss of life. Storm surge is still expected to be up to 13 feet. So I urge everyone in Hurricane Milton's path to listen to local officials and follow all the safety instructions they give. At this point, evacuation is probably difficult. So I encourage people to look for safer shelter. Sometimes moving just a few miles can mean the difference between life and death. We've already approved emergency declarations for Florida. We have thousands of federal personnel on the ground, and we've staged and are ready to go. We have 20 million meals, 40 million liters of water. At my direction, the Secretary of Defense, Austin, has pre-positioned search and rescue teams, helicopters, and high water speed vehicles as close to the storm as possible, so they're ready to conduct life-saving missions. And the administrator of FEMA will be on site tonight in Florida and the state's Emergency Operations Center. Both Administrator Criswell and I will be in constant contact with state and local officials in the hours ahead. Once the storm hits, we're going to work with state officials to clear debris, restore power, and do it as fast as possible. The Army Corps of Engineers will pump out water and decrease flooding. We've already directed the Department of Defense to be ready to provide active duty service members to support Florida after the storm surge if Governor DeSantis requests the help, which I expect he might, just like we did in North Carolina. I have surged over 1,000 U.S. Coast Guard personnel to perform search and rescue missions and reopen the port of Tampa as soon as possible. Now, I want to reiterate a point I made clear earlier today to the folks who have been impacted by Helene. This impact, and will be now impacted by Milton. Over the last few weeks, there's been reckless and irresponsible and relentless promotion of disinformation and outright lies about what's going on. It's undermining confidence in the people in Florida and incredible rescue and recovery work that has been undertaken. Literally, there are thousands of fellow Americans who are putting their lives at stake and putting on the line to do the dangerous work that needs to be done now. And it's harmful to those who most need the help. Quite frankly, these lies are un-American, and there's simply no place for them. Not now, not ever. Former President Trump has led this onslaught of lies. Assertions have been made that property is being confiscated. That's simply not true. They're saying people impacted by these storms will receive $750 in cash and no more. That is simply not true either. They're saying that money needed for these crises are being diverted to migrants. What the heck are they talking about? Stop it. It's outrageous. It's just not true. Now the claims are getting even more bizarre. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, is now saying the federal government is literally controlling the weather. We're controlling the weather. It's beyond ridiculous. It's so stupid. It's got to stop. Let me close with this. As difficult as these days and weeks have been, we've seen incredible courage by so many of our fellow Americans. I want to thank all the first responders for running toward danger instead of away from it, for saving lives and making a difference. FEMA personnel risking their lives, climbing on hillsides to reach people who cut off by Helena. Army National Guard flying through the gale wind force that it's amazing what they're doing. Firefighters lifting collapsed wood and metal in an attempt to see if there are survivors, any survivors under the debris, risking their lives. Coast Guard teams rappelling from helicopters to rescue people and risking their own lives. And there are countless friends and neighbors who have sacrificed for the greater good. Volunteers leaving their own families behind to help search for someone else's family. Fellow Americans looking out for one another. That's America at its very best. That's who we are. So my final message tonight is to the people of Florida and all the impacted states. We've got your back. We've got your back. And Kamala and I will be there for as long as it takes to rescue, recover, and rebuild. May God bless you all, and may God protect those serving in the eye of this storm on behalf of our nation. Thank you.
Why do you think Trump is spreading misinformation? Why do you think former President Trump has sent testing kits to President Putin during the height of the pandemic? Do you have a comment, sir? Why do you think Trump is
un-American?
Why do you think Trump is spreading misinformation?
I don't know. I simply don't know. You can speculate, but I just find it, I've used the phrase more than I've used it ever in my whole career, un-American. It's un-American. It's not who the hell we are. What are they talking about?
Sir, have you considered calling him and asking him to stop doing that? To stop spreading this?
Oh, come on.
Mr. President, does Governor DeSantis need to take Vice President Harris's calls?
All I can tell you is I'm talking to Governor DeSantis. He's been very gracious. He's thanked me for all we've done. He knows what we're doing, and I think that's important.
Can you say that Florida has everything it needs for the storm? How was your call with Netanyahu today?
We didn't talk about the storm.
And there you have the President of the United States noting that Florida is already feeling the impacts of Hurricane Milton, calling this one of the most destructive hurricanes to hit in over a century. The president also coming forward and making the case that they are surging a number of federal assets to help the people of Florida. He said there are 20 million meals available. There are 40 million liters of water. That Secretary Austin at the Department of Defense, leading the Pentagon, has pre-positioned assets to help in search and rescue. The president also noting that they have surged more than 1,000 Coast Guard personnel to the area. Having covered many hurricanes, our Coast Guard does an incredible job at rescuing people. They are the very best there is in this country in terms of helping people who are in a difficult situation. And so the Coast Guard, the president says, is there. And then interestingly, the president taking a large portion of his remarks to talk about what he called the reckless and harmful promotion of disinformation, naming former President Trump, saying that the lies he is telling are un-American. He said Donald Trump has led this onslaught of lies that are simply not true. And then he said, what the hell are they talking about? And singled out Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican congresswoman from Georgia, who has just recently claimed that the government is now controlling the weather. President Biden saying that is so stupid, and then once again calling this misinformation un-American. I do want to note that we have just gotten in a new storm track and want to get the very latest on that from senior national weather correspondent Rob Marciano. He is in Bradenton, that is south of Tampa. And Rob, good to see you. Tell us what you're experiencing there and what's the very latest that we're learning about the track of this storm.
Hello, Nora. Well, it's been a difficult afternoon already. A lot of this going on, but now the wind has been blowing the rain even more sideways. The time to evacuate is over. People are being told to shelter in place with winds gusting over tropical storm force. The bridges are shut down everywhere. We've already seen flooding. Take a look at the radar. You can see the center of this. It's just 60 miles offshore, just 60 miles now, and it's moving at 17 miles an hour. So do the math, and we can figure out the track on that. Multiple tornado warnings, over 100 of them throughout the afternoon, and over 10 reported tornadoes across the central part of the state. Heavy rain, flooding rain on the east side of the state. Matter of fact, that's where we've seen the highest wind gusts. St. Augustine, over a half a foot of rain already, and we're just getting going with this storm. It has engulfed over 3/4 of the state. All right, let's talk about the track. With it only being 60 miles offshore, 17 miles an hour, that's 3.5 hours now. So that's like 8:30, 9 o'clock Eastern time is when we expect the center to be coming across land. Somewhere, Sarasota, Bradenton, maybe jogging north into Tampa Bay, and that's what we've been worried about. If that happens, then that storm surge becomes a Tampa Bay problem. All afternoon, it's been blowing offshore and out of the bay. If it shifts north, they've got a problem. But it looks like the bulk of the surge is going to be from Sarasota and Bradenton down to Fort Myers, Port Charlotte, where they've experienced way too many of these storms with storm surge, up to 11, 12, 13, maybe 14 feet high a surge. But Tampa down to Fort Myers will see winds that will be damaging, and that will begin in about 2 hours and last well till after midnight. The acceleration of the storm should get it offshore shortly after tomorrow morning. But much like the storms that we've seen in the past that come at this time of year in this trajectory, it's going to be a West Coast and East Coast. Not many people in the state of Florida are going to escape this one. Nora?
And Rob, in all of your experience covering so many hurricanes and storms, how would you characterize its strength?
Well, it's explosion to Category 5 strength. We have only seen that a handful of times, so that's certainly alarming. Climate change certainly playing a role with that. We were forecasting it to weaken because of the shear that it's experiencing now. That happened a little bit later than we were comfortable with, quite honestly. But now that weakening is beginning to happen, and we're down to Category 3 strength. Should that drop your anxiety levels? Maybe a little bit, but it's still a major storm, and we are going to see major storm impacts and damage tomorrow morning when the sun comes up. Nora?
Rob Marciano, thank you for being there in Bradenton. Let's go now to national correspondent Jonathan Vigliotti. He is in Tampa. And Jonathan, tell me how people there are bracing for potential impact.
Yeah, good evening to you, Nora. The rain, the wind picking up. Already 4 inches of rain have fallen. A lot of flash flooding here in Tampa, and we're expecting upwards of 18 inches when all is said and done. For those that have chosen not to evacuate, they're going to be riding out a storm that the mayor here in Tampa has called unsurvivable. A number of threats. Rob mentioned some of them, including storm surge, 12 feet expected around here possibly. Also extreme wind. One of the biggest concerns that we have noticed, though, the pile of debris from all of the storm damage caused by Hurricane Helene 2 weeks ago. This community in the beginning process of really starting to clean up when they had to put everything down and evacuate. The issue now with the wind coming in, it doesn't take a lot to turn all of that debris into deadly projectiles. You have thousands of first responders that are staged throughout the state, search and rescue teams here in Tampa. They're going to be sheltering in place during this hurricane, meaning if there are emergency calls, they will not be able to respond until after the storm passes. You also have 50,000 linemen that are being brought into the state from all across the country as far west as California to assist with power outages. Officials here warning it could take several weeks. Nora?
Jonathan Vigliotti noting how many are on standby to try and quickly recover from this storm. Thank you, Jonathan, for being there. Want to turn now to Scott McFarland, who is at the White House. And Scott, interesting to hear the president rebuking former President Donald Trump and other Republican elected officials for spreading, in his words, outright lies, this misinformation about the federal response. And I do think it's noteworthy, too. I want to get your take on that. I mean, everyone from Republican Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina saying they've gotten all the federal help that they've needed and asked for. You have Chuck Edwards, who represents the North Carolina district that's been hit so hard, a Republican, essentially calling all these things that are out there outrageous rumors, that they're just not true. What are you hearing from White House officials about why they feel so strongly that this misinformation is penetrating?
This is really remarkable. On the day a major hurricane is hitting the United States, the White House has devoted so much bandwidth, time, and energy to knocking down this toxic cloud of conspiracy theories and misinformation. The president addressed it twice today. The White House press secretary did. The FEMA administrator did. But in those remarks a few moments ago, it's the first time somebody said it was Donald Trump who bears responsibility for these claims. There's concern it's slowed the evacuation. It's sowing distrust with FEMA and with federal officials. And I'll note this, Nora. Chuck Edwards, who you mentioned from North Carolina, Republican from that Western Carolina area, in an open letter to constituents, knocked down some of these myths, including having to say the government does not control the weather and FEMA is not trying to seize your property when they respond to a hurricane. That those things are being said out loud has really struck people here at the White House as necessary, but also pretty sad state of affairs.
An interesting note from Scott McFarland there, who also covers Capitol Hill for us, noting that a number of Republicans are condemning hurricane misinformation that is being spread by members of their own party. Our coverage of Hurricane Milton continues. For many of you, your local news is next, followed by the CBS Evening News. We're going to have a live interview with Governor Ron DeSantis, who has been in touch with President Biden. For continuous hurricane coverage, go to CBS News 24/7 all night. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell.
Picking up now from that CBS News special report, I'm Major Garrett in Washington. As you just heard, President Biden delivered remarks on Hurricane Milton as it moves toward Florida. He said the storm is expected to be one of the worst and most destructive this nation has seen in decades, if not longer. The president also made clear the federal government is ready to respond to the destruction that comes from Milton, whatever it might be. He also described misinformation about Milton and Hurricane Helene, which preceded it, as, quote, un-American, specifically name-checking former President Trump. Manny Bajorquez rejoins us now from Orlando. Manny, please forgive me. I'm sorry I had to interrupt you before. Please describe what's going on in Orlando and what they're bracing for.
No worries about the interruption. Here on the ground in Orlando, we are still awaiting the worst of the hurricane, but already getting bands of rain that are raising concerns about what is forecast to hit this area. Maybe not the storm surge that's going to hit the West Coast, but the amount of rainfall is still set to cause flash flooding here in Orlando. And also the winds could topple trees and power lines, so they're telling people to expect prolonged power outages. It's going to be a long night here for what has already been a long day as people try to do those last-minute preparations and evacuations. Already, the airport here ceased operations for commercial travel at 8 this morning. The major theme parks have closed now and likely will be closed all day tomorrow. And the dynamic you have playing out here in Orlando is that not only do you have the residents here who are hunkering down, trying to get away from flood-prone areas, you have potentially visitors who couldn't get home, who are now having to find a hotel, but also evacuees from the west coast of Florida who rode out Helene the last time, got a little concerned about what this one could bring and said, we're not going to ride it out this time. So they're all in this area as well. So yes, they may avoid the storm surge, but because it's still expected to be a hurricane when it hits this area, they're not going to avoid all the impacts.
Manuel Bajorquez, thank you for that excellent summary. We really appreciate it. Hurricane Milton could now make landfall in central Florida soon as 9 p.m. Eastern, maybe 9:30. We're tracking the Category 3 storm, and we will have the latest on its movements and possible implications soon. That's next on CBS News 24/7.
These are the stories
1, 2, 3, go!
of We the People.
We're trying to generate our own hope.
It's a huge deal.
I'm enabling